A mother's love is the scaffolding that holds up a skyscraper, but if the building decides it no longer needs the support, it shouldn't be surprised when the wind starts to shake the top floor. My name is Martha. At 53, my body is a diary of 1,000 long nights and countless small sacrifices. For 24 years, I was the silent engine that powered my son Dominic's life. My world didn't revolve around my own dreams. It was centered entirely on making sure his dreams had enough fuel to reach the stars. After my husband passed away when Dominic was just 4 years old, the weight of the world fell squarely on my shoulders. I didn't crumble under it. Instead, I took on 3 different jobs. I was a night shift accountant for a textile firm, a weekend bookkeeper for a local grocer, and a freelance tax consultant during the rare hours I had to breathe. I remember those years in vivid detail. The smell of cold coffee at 3 a.m. as I sat at the small wooden kitchen table surrounded by piles of spreadsheets and tax forms. My fingers would be cramped from typing, and my eyes would blur from the dim light of a single desk lamp. But every time I felt like giving up, I would look at the photo of Dominic on the wall, his bright eyes, his gap-toothed smile, and I would find a new reservoir of strength. I wasn't just working for a paycheck, I was investing in a legacy. When Dominic showed an interest in logistics and technology during high school, I didn't just cheer him on, I learned the industry with him. I stayed up late reading white papers on supply chain management and recursive algorithms so I could help him with his homework. I was his tutor, his mentor, and his first board of directors. When he graduated from university with a degree I had paid for by selling my only heirloom, a set of diamond earrings from my grandmother, he told me he wanted to start his own company. Aetherlink Solutions, he had called it. It was a bold name for a business that started in our cramped garage. In those early days, I was the one who designed the core logic for the logistics software. While Dominic was out networking and trying to find investors, I was in that garage debugging the code and ensuring that every shipping route was optimized for maximum efficiency. I wrote the recursive logic loops that would eventually make the company billions. I secured the first major contracts by using the professional relationships I had built over 30 years in accounting. I was the ghost in the machine, and at the time, I was happy to stay there. I wanted the world to see him as the genius, the boy wonder of tech. As the company grew, the garage was replaced by a small office, and then by a floor in a glass tower, and eventually by the tower itself. Dominic moved out of our modest suburban cottage and into a high-rise penthouse that overlooked the entire city. He started wearing suits that cost more than my annual salary as a clerk. He began to rub shoulders with the elite, the old money, the socialites, and the tycoons. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way he looked at me started to change. It started with small things. He would stop inviting me to company dinners, claiming they'd be too boring for me. He stopped mentioning my role in the early days of the company. In his public interviews, the story changed. He was no longer the boy whose mother helped him in the garage. He was the self-made visionary who had built an empire from nothing but a single laptop in a dream. I saw the shift, but I told myself it was just the price of success. I thought our bond was made of iron. I thought he knew that no matter how high he climbed, the ground he stood on was my heart. The true fracture occurred on the night of Dominic's engagement announcement. He was set to marry Genevieve, the daughter of Silas, a man who owned half of the luxury real estate in the country. This marriage wasn't just about love. It was a strategic alliance that would merge Aetherlink Solutions with Apex Grand Hospitality. It was the deal of a lifetime. The event was held at the Crystal Peak Hotel, a place where the chandeliers were made of hand-cut crystal and the floors were polished to a mirror finish. I had spent weeks preparing. I didn't want to embarrass him, so I sewn a new dress, a modest, elegant navy silk, and wore the only jewelry I had left, a simple string of pearls. My heart was full of pride as I stepped out of the taxi. I wanted to see my son happy. I wanted to meet the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. But I never made it to the ballroom. As I entered the lobby, Dominic intercepted me. He wasn't the son who used to bring me flowers for no reason. He was a stranger in a three-piece charcoal suit, his eyes darting around the room with a look of pure anxiety. He didn't hug me. He didn't even say hello. "Mother," he whispered, his voice sharp and cold, pulling me into a secluded alcove near the kitchen service entrance. "What are you doing here so early?" "Early?" I asked, confused. "The invitation said 7 o'clock, Dominic. I wanted to be here to meet Genevieve's parents." He winced at the mention of her parents. He looked at my dress, then at my pearls, then at my hands that were still calloused from years of work. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent hiss. "Silas and his wife, they have a very specific image of my background. They believe I come from a family of private investors. If they see you, if they hear your accent or find out you were a night shift clerk for 30 years, the social fallout will destroy the merger. The brand identity of Aetherlink Solutions is built on elite innovation, not suburban struggle." The noise of the party, the clinking of glasses, the laughter, the string quartet, suddenly felt like it was miles away. The coldness in his voice was a physical weight on my chest. "I'm an embarrassment to your brand, Dominic?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The woman who calculated your first profit margin is now a liability to your optics?" "Don't be dramatic, Mother," he snapped, checking his gold watch. "It's just business. Genevieve's family is very traditional. They value pedigree. I've told them you're a distant relative who lives in the countryside and doesn't get out much. I've set up a private room for you in the East Wing. There's a full dinner waiting for you there. You can watch the ceremony on the monitor. After it's over, I'll have a car take you home." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He handed it to me. "Here, it's a thank you for everything you've done. It's a diamond brooch. Just stay in the room, okay? Don't make a scene. I'll come by and see you before you leave." He walked away before I could even find the words to respond. I stood there in that cold, silent alcove holding the velvet box. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside: a bribe for my silence, a payment for my disappearance. I didn't go to the East Wing. I didn't wait for the car. I walked out of the Crystal Peak Hotel, the cold night air hitting my face like a bucket of ice water. I walked for blocks, the pearls around my neck feeling like a noose. Every step I took was a memory of a night I had stayed up for him, a holiday I had missed for him, a meal I had skipped for him. When I finally reached my cottage, the house felt different. It no longer felt like a home. It felt like a museum of a life I had wasted. I went to my study and sat at the desk, the same desk where I had written the code that made him a billionaire. I didn't cry. My eyes were dry and burning. Instead, I reached for the small iron-bound safe in the corner of the room. Dominic thought he was the architect of his life. He thought he had outgrown the scaffolding, but he had forgotten one very important detail. When we started Aetherlink, he was so young and so eager to get my help that he signed everything I put in front of him. I pulled out a thick leather-bound folder. Inside was the Legacy Protection Agreement. It was a document I had drafted with a lawyer friend years ago, back when I still believed in protecting Dominic's future. In his haste to become a CEO, he had never truly read the fine print. He didn't know that I didn't just own shares in the company. I owned the intellectual property rights to the core dynamic root algorithm, the very heart at Aetherlink's value. Without my consent, the company couldn't merge, it couldn't sell its assets, and it couldn't even operate its main server for more than 90 days without a new renewal. I was the majority shareholder of his soul, and he didn't even know it. I looked at his signature on the bottom of the page, a messy, youthful scrawl. Then I looked at the diamond brooch sitting on my desk. You wanted a world where I was invisible, Dominic. You wanted a brand without a mother. Well, you're about to find out that a building without a foundation doesn't just look bad, it falls down. The lesson wasn't going to be a simple argument. It was going to be a total deconstruction. I was going to show him that optics can't stop a collapse when the earth beneath you decides to move. The week following the engagement dinner was the quietest of my life, but inside my cottage it was the busiest. I didn't spend my days weeping over the broken relationship with my son. Instead, I spent them in my small study, surrounded by the ghosts of my old ledger books and a laptop that was far more powerful than it appeared. While Dominic was likely celebrating his successful optics with Genevieve at luxury resorts, I was meticulously tracing the digital and legal veins of the empire I had helped him build. I realized that my initial anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. To teach Dominic a lesson that would actually stick, I had to move with the cold precision of an auditor. I contacted an old friend, Arthur, a retired corporate attorney who owed me a favor from 20 years ago when I had found a massive embezzlement scheme in his firm that he had overlooked. When Arthur arrived at my cottage, his eyebrows shot up as he looked at the legacy protection agreement I had spread across the table. He spent 3 hours reading it in total silence, occasionally adjusting his glasses and humming to himself. "Martha," he finally said, leaning back and rubbing his eyes. "Dominic was a fool to sign this, but then again, he was 21, and he saw you as his safety net, not a legal entity. This clause here, Section 4.2, is a poison pill. It gives the holder of the intellectual property right the right to revoke all operational licenses if the integrity of the brand is compromised by the majority shareholder, and since you own 51% of that IP, you are the judge of that integrity." "I don't want to destroy the company," I said, my voice steady. "I just want to reclaim my seat at the table he tried to push me under. I want him to understand that a building is only as strong as its foundation." "If you trigger this," Arthur warned, "the merger with Apex Grand Hospitality won't just stall, it will become radioactive. Silas, Genevieve's father, is a man who buys certainty. The moment he finds out Dominic doesn't truly own the Aetherlink algorithm, he will walk away, and he will take Dominic's reputation with him." "Then let the world see what's underneath the suit," I replied. For the next few days, I acted as if nothing had changed. I even sent a polite text to Dominic, thanking him for the diamond brooch he had left in that cold alcove. He replied with a brief, dismissive message. "Glad you liked it, Mom. Let's talk after the merger is finalized. Busy weeks ahead." Busy weeks indeed. Dominic's first mistake was assuming I had retired from the world of finance because I lived in a cottage. He didn't know that I'd been quietly monitoring the company's internal server logs using an administrative back door I'd built during the garage days, a door he never bothered to close. I saw the preparations for the Global Integration Summit. I saw the way they were packaging my algorithm as Dominic's masterpiece. The emotional roller coaster took its first steep drop on the morning of the preliminary board meeting. I didn't show up with a protest sign. I didn't call the tabloids. Instead, I sent a formal encrypted legal notice to the board of directors of Aetherlink Solutions and to Silas's legal team at Apex Grand Hospitality. The subject line was simple: Notice of Intellectual Property License Revocation. I imagine the chaos that ensued in the glass tower, the panicked calls, the screaming in the hallways, the technicians frantically trying to understand why the core servers were suddenly displaying a 90-day countdown to a total shutdown. Dominic called me 30 minutes later. I let it ring. He called again and again. Finally, he sent a text. "What are you doing? Is this a mistake? Call me now." I didn't call. I was busy dressing for the summit. I chose a tailored charcoal suit that I'd kept from my days as a senior auditor, a suit that meant business. I didn't wear the diamond brooch. I wore my simple pearls. They were a reminder of where I came from, and they were stronger than any diamond bought with a bribe. When I arrived at the Crystal Peak Hotel for the summit, the same place where I had been hidden in a side room just days before, the security guards tried to stop me. They had been told to look for an elderly woman in a navy dress. They weren't prepared for the woman standing before them now. "I am Martha," I said, handing them my identification and the notarized board summons. "I am the majority stakeholder of the intellectual property rights for Aetherlink Solutions. If you block my entrance, the merger ends in this hallway." They moved aside. The walk to the boardroom felt like a mile. I could feel the eyes of the staff and the junior executives on me. They saw a woman in her 50s, silver hair styled sharply, walking with a purpose that didn't match the nanny or distant relative Dominic had described. As I pushed open the double doors of the boardroom, the scene was exactly as I had imagined. Silas was at the head of the table, his face like a thundercloud. Dominic was standing near the window, his face pale, his hands trembling as he stared at his tablet. Genevieve was there too, looking confused and annoyed. "Ah, the mysterious Martha," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Dominic told us you were unwell." "I've never felt better, Mr. Silas," I said, taking an empty chair at the table, the chair right next to my son. Dominic looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the fear of a little boy who had been caught in a lie. "Mother, please," he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is a billion-dollar deal. You're going to ruin everything." "No, Dominic," I said calmly. "I'm not ruining anything. I'm simply correcting the record. You told Silas that you were the sole architect of the dynamic route algorithm. You told the world that Aetherlink was a one-man vision. But this table needs to know that the engine of this company belongs to a trust that I control." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the original flowcharts, the ones hand-drawn on graph paper from 10 years ago. I designed the recursive logic, I secured the patents, and I signed them into a trust to protect you, Dominic. But that trust requires you to maintain the integrity of the founder's values. And since you've decided to erase the founder from the history of the company, I've decided that the company no longer has the right to use my work. Silas leaned forward, a predatory smile touching his lips. He looked at Dominic, then back at me. "Dominic told me your mother was a clerk who didn't understand your world." "She was," Dominic shouted, his ego finally snapping. "She's just an accountant. She doesn't know about the scaling, the global markets, the branding." "Branding is just a coat of paint, Dominic," I said calmly. "I own the bricks, and today I'm deciding who gets to live in the house." The room went into a frenzy. Silas's lawyers were whispering. Dominic was trying to grab the papers from the table, but the damage was done. The optics were shattered. The boy Wonder was revealed to be a tenant in a building he didn't own. I stood up to leave. "The countdown on your servers is real, Dominic. You have 89 days to decide if you want to be a CEO who respects his foundations or a man who loses his empire because he was too ashamed to admit who built it." As I walked out, I didn't look back. I could hear Silas laughing, a cold, appreciative sound. He knew that the merger was dead, but he also knew he had just witnessed the real power behind Aetherlink. I walked out of the hotel and signaled for a taxi. The roller coaster had just finished its first big drop, and the wind was screaming in my ears. I was no longer the invisible mother. I was the architect of his reckoning. The days following the boardroom confrontation were a whirlwind of fire and ice. Aetherlink Solutions was no longer a tech darling, it was a scandal. The news didn't just break, it shattered. Financial journals ran headlines like "the mother of all mistakes" and "Aetherlink, a house of cards." Dominic's face, once the symbol of youthful innovation, was now a meme for corporate deception. I stayed in my cottage, but I didn't hide. I spent my mornings in the garden, pruning the roses with the same careful precision I used for auditing. I knew Dominic's pattern. He was a creature of pride, and pride doesn't surrender, it doubles down. I expected him to fight, but I didn't expect him to use such cold, calculated tactics against his own mother. It started with a visit from a group of special inspectors. 3 men in dark suits arrived at my gate, claiming to be from the Municipal Zoning Board. They had anonymous reports that my cottage was structurally unsound and that my home office, where the original servers and logs were kept, was a safety hazard. It was a clear attempt at unjustified interference, a desperate move to push me out of my own space. "We'll need to seize all hardware and documents for a safety audit, ma'am," the lead inspector said, his voice void of emotion. I smiled at them, leaning on my garden shears. I knew exactly who had sent them. "I assume you have a court-ordered warrant signed by a judge who isn't on the payroll of my son's holding company." They blinked, surprised that a suburban mother knew the terminology. This is a municipal matter. This is an unacceptable intrusion, and since I have 3 security cameras currently live streaming this interaction to a private cloud server managed by Arthur, my attorney, I suggest you leave before the authorities arrive to ask why the zoning board is suddenly interested in private intellectual property. They left with their tires kicking up gravel. Dominic was getting desperate. He wasn't trying to talk to me, he was trying to intimidate me. He thought that if he could take the physical copies of the Legacy Protection Agreement, the law would simply forget it existed. He forgot that the woman who taught him to double-check his work would never keep just 1 copy. The emotional toll, however, came from an unexpected direction. Genevieve showed up at my door that evening. She wasn't the arrogant heiress I had seen at the summit. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed, stripped of the glamour she usually wore as a shield. "I didn't come here to defend him," she said, standing on my porch. "I came to ask, why? Why would you do this to your own son? You've humiliated him in front of the entire world. My father has blacklisted him from every venture in the city. He's losing everything because of this public fallout." I invited her in. I made tea, simple herbal tea. "Genevieve, do you know what happens to a building when the soil shifts?" "It cracks," she said, her voice small. "No," I corrected, "it falls." Dominic didn't just hide me, he tried to delete the truth of his own origin. If I had let this merger go through, your father would have found out about the IP rights 6 months from now, or a year. He would have sued Dominic for fraud, and Dominic would have faced severe legal consequences. By stopping this now, I'm not ruining his life, I'm giving him a chance to save it, but he has to lose the mask first. Genevieve looked around my modest home, the photos of Dominic as a boy, the books on logic, the worn-out furniture. "He told me you were making unreasonable demands. He said you were trying to compromise his success because of personal grievances." "Success is a collective effort, Genevieve. He just wanted to be the only one on the podium, even if it meant stepping on the person who built it for him." She left with a confused expression, but I knew I had planted a seed of doubt. The next day, the poison pill countdown reached 85 days. Dominic's second move was more public. He went on a televised business news segment. He sat there, looking humble and wounded, and spoke about internal family misunderstandings. He suggested, without saying it directly, that my mother was struggling with the complexities of modern business, and that the legal documents were an old mistake born from my lack of technical awareness. I watched him on the screen. He looked so convincing. For a moment, I saw the little boy who could charm his way out of a broken vase. But then I saw the diamond cufflinks, the ones bought with the money from the algorithm I wrote. He was using his platform to cast doubt on my mental clarity, a low blow that showed just how far he had drifted from the values I taught him. I picked up my phone and called Arthur. "It's time for Phase 3. Release the logs." The logs weren't just legal documents, they were the metadata from the last 10 years of Aetherlink. They showed the timestamps of every major update to the algorithm. They showed that 90% of the core logic was uploaded from a remote IP address, my home office, during hours when Dominic was logged into social media at luxury clubs and gala events. The data was undeniable. It was a digital fingerprint. It proved that while Dominic was the face, the mind was elsewhere. The reaction from the business community was instantaneous. The public sympathy for the victim of a misunderstanding evaporated. Now he was seen as a leader who had claimed credit for work he didn't do. The board of directors at Aetherlink went into an emergency session. They didn't just want a merger anymore. They wanted a leader with integrity. But they couldn't move forward without me, because without the license from my trust, the company had no product. That night, the high-performance engine returned to my driveway. This time, there was no burst of energy. The door didn't slam. I heard a slow, heavy knock. When I opened the door, Dominic was standing there in the rain. His designer suit was soaked, clinging to him like a second skin he couldn't shed. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, he didn't look through me. He looked at me as if he was finally seeing the reality of the situation. "I can't outrun the truth, can I?" he asked, his voice hollow. The truth isn't something you run from, Dominic. It's the only thing you can eventually stand on, but right now you're standing on nothing. He walked into the kitchen and sat at the old wooden table. He looked at the empty seat across from him, the seat where he used to do his homework while I worked on my ledgers. "What do you want, Mother? What is the real cost of fixing this? I'll sign whatever you want, just don't let the company die." "The company is just glass and wires, Dominic," I said, sitting across from him. "I don't care about the shares. I care about the son I raised who seems to have disappeared under all that expensive fabric. If you want to save Aetherlink, you have to stop being its visionary and start being its servant." The roller coaster was at its lowest point. The darkness was total, but in that darkness, for the first time, there was a glimmer of actual honesty. "I've lost everything, haven't I?" he whispered. "On the contrary," I replied, "you finally lost the weight of the lies. Now let's see if you're strong enough to build something real." Dominic sat slumped in the kitchen chair, his wet hair matted against his forehead, looking less like a billionaire CEO and more like a lost soul. The rain continued to lash against the window, mirroring the chaos that had consumed his life in the city. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, the same clock that had witnessed his childhood tantrums and his late-night study sessions. "What does being a servant mean, Mother?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I've spent years building a culture of excellence. I've led hundreds of people. You want me to give that up to be what? A janitor? I want you to be a human being, Dominic," I replied, standing up to pour 2 mugs of hot cocoa, the simple ritual we used to share before the world became about optics and scaling. I set the mug in front of him. He stared at it as if it were an alien object, his expensive watch catching the dim light of the kitchen. "You've spent so much time looking at the view from the penthouse that you've forgotten how the elevator works. You've forgotten that the data points in your spreadsheets are actual people with families, bills, and pride." I leaned against the counter, looking at the man I had sacrificed 24 years of my life for. "Here is my condition for signing the IP release and saving Aetherlink Solutions from total liquidation. You will officially resign as CEO, effective immediately. The board will appoint an interim leader, someone with actual operational experience, not just a talent for public relations." Dominic flinched as if I had struck him. "Resign? That's social suicide. The industry will think I was fired for incompetence. Genevieve's father will ensure I never get a seat at another table." "You were incompetent, Dominic," I said gently but without hesitation. "You failed to manage the most basic asset of any business, the truth. But that's only the first part. The second part is where the real work begins. You will spend 1 full year working as a junior logistics clerk in the very warehouse where our shipping routes are managed, the Southside Distribution Center. You will earn the same starting salary as everyone else. You will live in a small, rented apartment nearby. No driver, no penthouse, no expense account." "You can't be serious," he gasped, his eyes widening in pure shock. "I have a reputation. I have a lifestyle. I don't even know how to use the old inventory systems." "Your lifestyle was a loan from a mother you tried to hide. The loan is now due. For 1 year, you will see the world from the bottom up. You will learn the names of the drivers. You will understand why the algorithm I wrote matters to the man trying to get home to his daughter on time. And every Sunday you will come here. You will cook dinner for me, simple meals, Dominic, and we will discuss what you learned that week, not about profit margins, but about integrity and the people who actually move the boxes." Dominic looked at the cocoa, the steam rising in the dim light. The struggle in his eyes was palpable. He was calculating the cost of his pride versus the cost of losing his entire legacy. If he refused, Aetherlink would be dead within weeks. His name would be synonymous with failure and fraud forever. If he accepted, he would be humiliated in the eyes of his elite friends, but he would have a path back to his own soul. "And if I do this," he asked, his voice trembling, "after the year is over, what then? If you complete the year with genuine humility and not a single complaint to the press, I will sign the IP over to the company permanently, and I will support your reinstatement to the board, not as a king, but as a partner who has earned his place. But if you cheat, if you use your old connections to bypass the struggle, or if you treat those workers with the same disdain you showed me, I will walk away and let the company burn. I have enough saved to live comfortably in this cottage. Do you?" Dominic sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a trembling hand, he reached for the pen I had left on the table. It wasn't the gold fountain pen he usually used. It was a simple plastic ballpoint he used to use for school. As he signed the resignation letter, I felt a strange light sensation in my chest. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reconstruction. I was stripping away the rot to see if the wood underneath was still strong enough to hold. "Good," I said, taking the paper from him. "Your shift starts at 6 a.m. on Monday. I've already spoken to the floor manager, a man named Harlan. To him, you're just Dom, a new hire with a troubled background looking for a second chance. Don't disappoint him, and more importantly, don't disappoint yourself." As Dominic walked out into the clearing night, he looked smaller, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He was no longer a brand. He was a man beginning a long, difficult walk back to the ground. I sat back down at the table and picked up my knitting needles. The first part of the reconstruction was complete. I hadn't just saved the company, I had started the process of saving my son. The year ahead would be an emotional roller coaster for both of us, but for the first time in a decade, the foundation was finally starting to settle. Monday morning arrived with a cold, unrelenting gray light. For the first time in 10 years, Dominic didn't wake up to a digital assistant announcing his schedule or the smell of artisanal coffee brewed by his housekeeper. Instead, he woke up to a harsh, buzzing alarm in a cramped studio apartment that smelled of old paint and floor wax. I sat in my cottage, sipping my own tea, knowing exactly what he was experiencing. I had spent 30 years of my life in that rhythm. I knew the weight of the morning air when you have a shift to catch and a body that isn't quite ready to move. When Dominic arrived at the Southside Distribution Center, he was wearing a plain gray jumpsuit and heavy work boots. The tower of glass and steel where he once reigned felt like it belonged to a different planet. Here, the world was made of corrugated iron, the smell of diesel exhaust, and the constant deafening hum of conveyor belts. Harlan, the floor manager, was a man whose face looked like a topographical map of hard work. He didn't look at Dominic's resume. He didn't care about his degree. He just handed him a digital scanner and a pair of heavy gloves. "You're on the loading dock, Dom," Harlan barked over the noise of a departing truck. "If the boxes stop moving, the money stops flowing. You miss a scan, you're on the hook. Move it." Dominic's first day was a brutal descent into the reality of the company he thought he owned. In his office, a logistics error was just a red line on a digital chart. On the floor, it was a heavy crate falling over, a driver shouting because his schedule was ruined, and the physical strain of lifting, carrying, and sorting for 8 hours straight. By noon, his hands were blistering through the gloves. By 3 p.m., his back felt like it was being scorched by fire. But the real pain wasn't physical. It happened during the afternoon break. A group of senior executives from Aetherlink Solutions, men who used to laugh at his jokes and scramble to hold the elevator for him, walked through the warehouse on a site inspection. They were accompanied by Silas's father, Silas, who was scouting the facility as part of the post-scandal audit. Dominic tried to turn his face away, pulling his cap low over his eyes. He stayed in the shadows of a stack of pallets, his heart hammering against his ribs. I heard their voices, the polished, arrogant tones of men who thought they were superior because they wore silk ties. It's a shame about Dominic, but I suppose that's what happens when you build a career on a foundation of sand. The board is much happier now that we have a real professional in the interim seat. "The boy was a billboard," Silas replied coldly, "a billboard with a leak. At least the warehouse is still functional. Let's move on." Dominic stayed hidden until the sound of their leather shoes faded. He looked at his calloused, dirty hands and then at the boxes piled high around him. For a moment, I think he wanted to run. I think he wanted to throw the scanner down and scream that he didn't belong here. But then he looked at the worker next to him, a man in his 60s named Gus, who was moving with a slow, steady rhythm despite a visible limp. "First day's the hardest, kid," Gus offered him a dented water bottle. "The boxes don't care who you think you are. They only care if you're strong enough to move them." That Sunday, Dominic showed up at my cottage. He didn't drive his luxury car. He took the bus. He looked exhausted. His skin a shade paler, and he walked with a slight limp. He didn't speak when he came in. He just went to the kitchen, took the bag of potatoes I had left out, and started peeling them. He didn't use a machine. He did it by hand, his movements slow and clumsy. "How was the warehouse, Dominic?" I asked, sitting at the table with my knitting. "It's loud," he said after a long silence, "and it's cold, and the people, they don't talk about innovation. They talk about their kids' dental bills and whether the bus will be on time." He stopped peeling and looked at me, his eyes raw. "I saw Silas today. He walked right past me. He looked at me like I was part of the machinery. I've never felt smaller." "You're not smaller," I said softly. "You're just finally at eye level with the world. You've spent 10 years looking down. Now you're looking across. That's where the truth lives." He didn't argue. He just went back to the potatoes. That night, for the first time in a decade, we ate a meal in total silence. Not a cold, angry silence, but a heavy, thoughtful one. He didn't check his phone once. He just ate the food he had cooked with his own blistered hands. The roller coaster was no longer dropping. It was grinding along the tracks, slow and painful, but it was finally moving in a straight line. The 5th month at the warehouse was the true turning point. Dominic was no longer the man who flinched at the sound of a forklift or looked at his watch every 10 minutes. His transition was physical. His shoulders had filled out and the softness of the boardroom had been replaced by the lean strength of a laborer. But the real change was internal. One afternoon, the Southside Distribution Center descended into chaos. The Aetherlink system, the very algorithm I had written and Dominic had mismanaged, began to glitch. On the monitors, shipping routes were overlapping, trucks were being sent to the wrong docks, and a massive bottleneck was forming that threatened to halt the entire regional supply chain. In the past, Dominic would have called an emergency meeting and blamed the IT department, but that day, he didn't. He stood in the middle of the loading dock, watching as Gus and the other drivers grew increasingly frustrated. He saw the human cost of the error: a driver who wouldn't make it to his son's birthday, a warehouse worker who would have to stay for an unpaid double shift. Dominic walked into Harlan's office. He didn't demand authority. He offered a solution. "Harlan, I know this system," he said calmly. "It's not a server crash. It's a recursive loop error in the route optimization code. If we manually bypass the primary node and reset the local cache, we can get the trucks moving in 20 minutes. Harlan looked at him, squinting. "And how would a junior clerk know that, Dom?" "Because I watched the person who built it," Dominic replied, looking Harlan in the eye. "I didn't listen then, but I remember now." Harlan, sensing the sincerity and the sheer competence in Dominic's gaze, stepped aside. For the next hour, Dominic worked. He didn't sit in a leather chair. He leaned over a dusty terminal on the warehouse floor, his grease-stained fingers flying across the keys. He wasn't doing it for optics or for the board of directors. He was doing it so Gus could go home. He fixed the loop, the system hummed back to life, the bottleneck cleared. As the trucks began to roll out, the workers gave a small, weary cheer. Gus clapped Dominic on the back. "Good job, kid. You're more than just muscle, I guess." That Sunday, when Dominic arrived at my cottage, he didn't wait for me to give him the groceries. He brought them himself, bought with his own clerk salary. He cooked a simple roast chicken, and for the first time, he sat down at the table and didn't look like he was waiting for the clock to run out. "I realized something today, Mom," he said, carving the meat with steady hands. "I used to think Aetherlink was about being the smartest person in the room. I thought it was about the billions, but it's actually about the people who move the boxes. If the system fails them, I've failed as a leader." I looked at my son. The arrogance was gone. The shame had been replaced by a quiet, grounded pride. He had carried the stones, and he had learned that the foundation isn't something you hide, it's something you honor. "The year isn't over, Dominic," I said softly. "I know," he replied, and he actually smiled. "I'm learning more in that warehouse than I ever did in that glass tower." 7 months later, the year was up. I stood before the board of Aetherlink Solutions with Silas and Genevieve in attendance. They expected me to reclaim the company or sell it off. Instead, I stood next to Dominic. He was wearing the suit again, but it wasn't a costume this time. It was a uniform of responsibility. I am signing over 100% of the intellectual property rights to Aetherlink Solutions, I announced to the stunned room. But on one condition, the company will establish a foundation board, a group of representatives from the warehouse and logistics staff who have an equal vote on all operational changes. And my son, Dominic, will return as the director of operations, not the CEO, but the man who answers to the workers. Silas looked at Dominic, then at me. He saw a man who had been broken and rebuilt into something much stronger than a brand. I've never seen a comeback like this, Silas admitted, shaking Dominic's hand. Welcome back to the table, Dominic. This time, I think you actually belong here. As we walked out of the building, Genevieve caught up with us. She looked at Dominic with a new kind of respect, not for his money, but for his character. They didn't get back together immediately, but the door was no longer locked. Dominic and I walked toward my old car. Are you coming to the cottage for dinner, Dominic? He asked. Only if you're cooking, I joked. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said, helping me into the passenger seat. The roller coaster had finally come to a stop. The ride was long, the drops were terrifying, and the turns were sharp. But as I looked at my son, a man who finally understood that his mother wasn't an embarrassment, but the architect of his soul, I knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. The building was no longer shaking. The foundation was finally and forever made of truth.